That kid is in this class.
Yeah.
He's sitting right there. That kid is there. I'm going home.
Are you not gonna help fill tests?
I'm not gonna be any help.
That's
Literally today, I sat there and wrote our names in every type of way I could.
Okay, that's pretty good. That's good contribution.
Yeah. So it was either I wrote John, Nathan, Ethan, Christopher. I wrote Christopher, Nathan, John.
Cross off work and switch something.
Yeah.
My group actually did pretty good.
You guys, you're still taking notes?
Well, I was planning, but seniors don't have to take notes. I'm just like teaching them how to nod.
He's talking over now.
Non-seniors though, like in a few of you, if you take those notes.
I mean, non-seniors.
Seniors not going to be punished. So, what
That's
I
not
did,
senior.
I
I don't think
sent
that.
something out on senior class.
This guy's senior?
You're gonna keep interrupting. So either.
I'm just go home. That's fine.
Oh, it's fine. Either just look I'm waiting.
You want these notes, John?
Yeah, see that. So, that's what, I sent out on Google Classes just an announcement, just like the second section notes, which I just basically filled out. You weren't supposed to do anything with them. I was just giving them to you. Because yesterday we were talking about mainly Spain and Portugal, and their kind of like colonial claims. This one was mainly talking about France, some explorers like, Marquette and Joliet, which we talked about, Illinois, like last chapter, England, and then the Netherlands, Dutch, like mainly their main settlement, New Amsterdam, which becomes New York. So that's on there. And then the last section here, something I probably need to kind of change the kind of title for. It's like positive, negative aspects of European colonization here. With this, we see the kind of like also like, there's this concept of what they call the triangular trade, where you see like kind of like Europe, Africa, and the Americas are kind of connected with commerce and trade. Yesterday I was telling you guys about there was a map in 1507, which was the first map to have America on there. This is what they call the Wolder-Muller Sea map, which was made by a German cartographer in 1507. This is America over here, right over here. All right, so it's kind of limited, you see, and the word America appears on what right here where South America is. All right. As you see, cartography changed over time. But do you remember who he named America after?
Amerigo.
Amerigo Vespucci, who would like returned from kind of the New World after just kind of mapping out kind of that part of kind of northern part of South America. So he's basically this map as it catches on. That's where that term America comes from. Now, the United States, we're known as America generally throughout the world, mainly because we're the first country to gain our independence from a European colony. So at this time, America is just this entire region, right? This specifically, as we talk about around the world, America today, they're talking about kind of the United States of America. All right. And so with this kind of connection here, like one definitely positive aspect of this is the kind of introduction and the exchange of agricultural goods on both ends. So the Europeans, when they come to the Americas, they bring with them domestication of animals, things like horses, oxen, mainly for kind of use for hauling and stuff like that. Cows, pigs. At times, pigs can be somewhat of an invasive kind of species. I don't know if you've in the Bahamas, there's a place where you can go and you can swim with pigs. They were brought there by the Spanish. So they've been around for a while there. Also, Europeans are going to introduce like cereal grains like wheat, barley, rice. Oranges, like Florida, like with the Spanish colonization, they bring with them Valencia oranges, named after Valencia, Spain. Coffee, sugarcane are two crops that are going to require a lot of cultivation of land and a lot of labor. All right, that we'll talk a little bit later. And then, in turn, Europeans are going to be introduced to and bring back with them to kind of Europe, and then kind of spread throughout the world as some of these countries gaining colonies in Africa and Asia and that. Things like corn, which is a revolutionary crop. Nearly every food that we have has some type of corn or corn syrup in it. Potatoes, another revolutionary crop, which has origins in the Andes with the Inca and the Moche and those groups. In the Andes, they had like 200 varieties of potatoes. They are a relatively kind of easy crop to grow. They're kind of a poor man's crop, so they're in places like Ireland, for example, which became a little too kind of dependent upon that, which leads to the Irish diaspora. Tomatoes, tobacco, which really the Europeans took to. And if you ever get a chance to travel to Europe, they still are kind of big fans of smoking. But this is going to be very, very popular in Europe. And then chocolate. The Europeans are going to be the ones who kind of add sugar and milk to it to make it the sweet kind of treat that we know it is today. And then also like there's going to be cultivated in Africa. Like today, for the most chocolate is produced in West Africa, like the Ivory Coast and that area. So this could be a positive thing where we see this exchange of goods and agricultural kind of products and that. Another one is the spread of Christianity, which can be debatable at times because we talked about yesterday this being kind of the ends to justify the means. There were a number of Christian missionaries that were along with explorers that had good intentions. In many cases, the kind of type of Christianity that was kind of brought to the New World, and still to this day, is generally the kind of the form of Christianity that colonizers kind of brought with them as we get into the Reformation. Like particularly kind of areas controlled by the Spanish, Portuguese, and the French tend to be Roman Catholic still to this day. So that's why much of Latin America, like Brazil, Central America, Mexico, most of South America are predominantly Roman Catholic. Where the English and the Dutch kind of introduced their form of Protestantism, like today in Jamaica, like the Episcopalian Church is one of the largest churches there, with English after they took over Jamaica from the Spanish. The Dutch controlling kind of like islands in the Caribbean and Suriname in South America. The deal is like a lot of like kind of Christian missionaries would provide education, medicine for native populations. However, the medicine thing was kind of a necessity because Europeans were bringing diseases, and we talked about that a little bit yesterday in that video. Epidemics, which is the rapid spreading diseases, like pandemics we're living in through right now, right? Same kind of concept. So Europeans bring with them smallpox, measles, influenza. The native populations didn't generally have the immune system to handle. And we were talking about the kind of defeat of the Aztecs by Cortez and the conquistadors. It wasn't necessarily by the kind of military dominance or sheer numbers, because the conquistadors were greatly outnumbered. It was mainly because they brought smallpox there. All right, and in certain cases, these kind of like pandemics, these epidemics, can wipe out 90% of population, native population. So, example, Hispaniola, the island of Hispaniola, which is today Haiti and Dominican Republic, population of kind of native populations, the Caribe or the Tano, about 250,000, they believe. Within about 50 years, it was down to 500. Now, initially, when the Spanish and Portuguese are making these kind of colonies, they were using the native populations for cheap labor. When these populations, which were all relatively small to begin with, start to die off, they have to look to other areas for that cheap labor. And the cheapest labor in world history is slave labor. So this is the introduction of the African slave trade. There's a direct correlation between European colonization of the New World and kind of the slave trade. And Europeans inserting themselves into already existing trade patterns. Slavery was existing in Africa, like slavery is as old as civilization since we date back talking about the Sumerians. And that it's in this sense where we're going to bring this into more of a kind of a racial component. And you're usually the African slaves were working in mines, plantations. In Brazil, they call them latifúndias, or these sizable plantations. Cultivation of things like sugar cane and tobacco, and that were kind of a big source of labor. And so this is something that we're still kind of dealing with today, the ramifications of. So I'm going to play this TED video that talks about the Atlantic slave trade.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy: the Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
So the slaves mainly came from the west coast of Africa, what they refer to as the Gold Coast or the Slave Coast later. So stretching from Senegal in the north all the way down to Angola in the south. So before Europeans started to carve out colonies in Africa themselves, they were dealing directly with African kingdoms. So I talked about last chapter 7. I talked about the kingdom of Benin, where their king, their Oba Ozulao, was the first one to open up the kind of like the slave trade to Europeans. So we start to see kind of like this kind of the Europeans inserting themselves into already kind of existing trade patterns. The overwhelming majority going to basically Brazil and the Caribbean. It's later when the English get involved, you see more of them going to kind of like what is the United States, the colonies there. And so before they were basically, you found that the Europeans kind of continuously coming to Africa. A lot of European kingdoms, what they would do is create what they call factories. They didn't produce anything. They were basically holding pens. And so they would have like a holding pen specifically for Spain, specifically for Portugal, specifically for France, England, so on and so forth. This is a famous one. This is the one in Ghana that President Obama visited like in 2009. This is what they call basically the point of what they refer to as the African diaspora. A diaspora is just basically people that are basically kind of forced to leave their homeland. Like the Jewish diaspora lasted up until the time of the creation of the state of Israel, if you will. And so, in a sense here, what we find is this kind of like millions and millions of people basically being brought across the Atlantic Ocean for the purpose of working on large kind of plantations and farms and stuff like that. So that journey from Africa to the New World is often referred to as the Middle Passage, the trip across the Atlantic Ocean. The peak of the kind of African Atlantic slave trade is about the 1700s, 18th century. You got 6 to 7 million people within that kind of like 100-year period that are basically being brought to the Americas. Numbers as high for the entire kind of period as high as 15 million. But the numbers it's kind of hard to get an exact number because a lot of them were, about 20% of them never really made it to the Americas there. All right. So this is something that's like kind of part of our history that probably needs to be addressed. This is another video, so it's only 5 minutes. Some of the stuff is talked about in the last one, but specifically about the horrible journey that what in the Middle Passage entailed. It can be somewhat graphic. So
from about 1525 to 1866, 12.5 million Africans were taken from their homeland and forcibly transported across the Atlantic, a journey that approximately 2 million of them would not survive. By the turn of the 18th century, European merchants were building vessels capable of transporting hundreds of enslaved people per journey. These ships had extra portholes for ventilation, weapons mounted on deck in case of rebellion, and additional compartments added below deck to take on more human cargo. Before boarding the ships at African port cities, enslaved people were stripped of their clothing and remaining possessions and had their heads forcibly shaved. During boarding, which could take weeks or even months, enslaved people lived on the deck of the ship in a temporary wooden house constructed by the crew. The crew also installed netting around the deck of the ship, designed to catch those enslaved who might opt for death over forced servitude. Once moved below deck, enslaved people would find themselves stuffed into compartments with ceilings as low as 4.5 feet, where they would spend most of their voyage. They were segregated by gender and age. Adult men were kept separately and shackled in pairs. Women usually left unchained in their designated compartment, and children often free to move about the ship. There were no sanitary facilities of any kind. Enslaved people were forced to relieve themselves where they sat, creating hellish conditions when combined with the heat and lack of ventilation below deck. Disease was rampant. Dysentery, malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, measles, and influenza ravaged the enslaved and crew members alike. The enslaved people generally spent about 8 hours a day above deck, but were still separated by gender, with a barricada, a reinforced wall that could be used to protect crew members in case of a revolt. Enslaved people were also subject to forced exercise, which sometimes included dance and song for the entertainment of the crew. Enslaved captives deemed disobedient were tortured and beaten, usually whipped with the especially cruel cat-o'-nine-tails, a tool designed to inflict maximum pain. Enslaved people who refused to eat their typical meal of rice and beans were forced to do so, sometimes with a speculum oris, a medieval tool used to force open a person's mouth. Women, while usually left unshackled, were raped and sexually abused by members of the crew, sometimes arriving in the New World, carrying the children of their attackers. But it was the women, using their minuscule freedoms, who would often coordinate mutinies against their captors. But these rebellions were rarely successful. The true extent of the horrors of the Middle Passage came to light in a 1783 court trial over the slave ship Zong. The Zong left present-day Ghana in August of 1781, with 442 enslaved on board. After a 2-month journey riddled with navigation errors, 62 enslaved people and 7 crew members had perished without reaching their destination. Disease was spreading throughout the ship, and fresh water was running dangerously low. Captain Luke Collingwood was afraid of the financial cost of more deaths. Enslaved people that died of disease were not covered by the ship's insurance, but the enslaved who drowned were. Collingwood ordered approximately 130 enslaved people thrown overboard. He claimed it was necessary to do so to halt the spread of disease. At the trial between the Zong's owners and their insurance company, the owners argued that because it was legal to kill sick animals for the health of a ship, it was legal to treat enslaved people the same. The court agreed with the ship's owners, but the trial itself exposed the horrors aboard the Zong, and its story was republished by British abolitionists with the name of the ship redacted, meant to show that this tragedy could happen on any ship transporting enslaved people across the Middle Passage. 24 years after the Zong trial, the international slave trade was outlawed in both Great Britain and the United States. It would take England an additional 26 years and the US another 58 years plus a civil war before the practice of slavery was officially abolished.
So
From about 15
the one video was talking about the whole concept of like kind of tight packers and kind of loose packers there. The most famous incident was the British slave ship the Brooks, which was in the 18th century to 1700s, designed to probably hold a little shy of about 500 slaves. They would continuously pack it close to about 800. All right, and so you have, these people are basically treated as like property, like that the issue with the Zong, where the ship owner made a calculated decision to throw 130 overboard because he would get money for them, right? What ends up happening is that kind of sparks a little bit of the abolitionist movement in England, or at least kind of like strengthens it. Just last summer in England, there was a statue of a guy named Edward Colston during the George Floyd kind of protests there. His statue was ripped down in Bristol. There's a lot of places in Bristol that were named after him. He and was thrown into the to the sea there because he probably made the most amount of money off the slave trade. And so they did something similar in Baltimore with the statue of Christopher Columbus as well. So this is something that we're still kind of ramifications of kind of dealing with in kind of generational kind of like and the 1619 project. Something that was a couple of years ago that came out to commemorate the first slaves arriving in Virginia, in the American colonies, kind of addresses that. And then in basically kind of a lot of times the Europeans would kind of establish presence in these places. They would establish kind of social classes. In Latin America, particularly in the Spanish and Portuguese areas, you would find at the top the Pencelares. These were basically the ones who are the kind of European born. They were the highest class. They were the governors, the officials, and stuff like that. Right below them would be their children, the first generation of Europeans born in the New World. What they were to Europeans would refer to as Creoles. Now today, Creoles means basically a mix of European, African, kind of native populations and stuff like that. Like New Orleans, there's a lot of Creole kind of traditions and music and food and stuff like that. And then obviously the lowest would be kind of slaves, and then kind of native populations, usually kind of right there equally. Within some of the Creoles, you even have kind of like a mixing here, what we call mestizos and mulattoes. Mestizos would be the ones who are a mix of European and native populations. Mestizos still to this day make up the largest population in places like Mexico, Central America, most of South America. And then mulattoes, which is the mix of European and African. Brazil is a sizable population. A lot of the Caribbean islands, you would get that. So these are the kind of various kind of classes that would kind of emerge as a result of kind of colonization. So that's it. That's basically world history class here. Didn't get as far as I wanted to, but it's a pandemic. What are you gonna do? All right. Like I said, seniors, you guys are excused from this assignment because of my poor planning. Non-seniors, if you just turn it in, you get the points for it.